Hello and welcome from me, Mike Scott in Oxford in the UK and Mike Collins in Maryland in the USA to this Zoom series event, Cultural Encounters, Books That Have Made a Difference. In this series, we are bringing together scholars and their audiences in order to explore themes of encounter in literary works and contemporary cultural debates. Today, we welcome also Dr. Rebecca Boland from Georgetown University, who's going to talk to us about Tess of the D'Urbervilles. Rebecca Boland has been teaching in Georgetown University's English department since the fall of 2006. As a teacher, her main goal is to encourage and mentor students to find ways intellectually to imagine and articulate critical thinking questions and responses to the ideas in the works we study. As a scholar, she most enjoys exploring ways the imagistic language of a particular writer illuminates a nuanced truth of human nature, from why we know desire and fear, to why we express, recreate, refine, or destroy who we are. I think those are to kind of sum her up, really, that she first thinks about the student. She first thinks about how we teach the student and how we learn. Rebecca earned her BA from Carleton College, her MAT from the University of Chicago, and her PhD from George Washington University. She's published many articles and is currently working on a book exploring visual art in the 19th century novel as knowledge, desire, and the uncanny. I'll hand over to her in just a moment, but first, if you have any questions that occur to you during the talk, please type them into us using the Q&A button. Please do not use the chat button. Towards the end, Mike Collins will put those questions to Rebecca, and as many questions as possible she'll try to answer, but she can only answer them if you've typed them in. So start typing them in from the start. So with that, I'm really looking forward to the next 40 minutes or so. Over to you, Rebecca.
Thank you so much, Michael. In a talk exploring the paradoxical proximity of remembering and forgetting, and perhaps even arguing their symbiotic relationship within the act of atonement, I wish not to forget some most important remembrances. To Michael Scott, thank you for creating these encounters and for graciously including me beside many esteemed colleagues providing invigorating cultural connections with books that have made all the difference. To Mike Collins, thank you for our many conversational encounters engaging with so many aspects of the humanities and for your productive literary partnership with Michael. To Mary Gordon, thank you for your knowledgeable orchestration and warm calm that have led me to this screen. And to all of you joining in today to remember Hardy's unforgettable Tess, thank you. As Oscar Wilde and Bertolt Brecht remind us, the narrative is not complete or the performance fully delivered until the reader, the audience, participates. And so we begin. The dialectics of remembering and forgetting, uncanny atonement in Hardy's Tess of the D'Urbervilles. As I was thinking how I might launch this particular study of Tess, focusing on Thomas Hardy's creation, or perhaps recreation, of the wronged Victorian woman of Dorset's Vale of Blackmore, I found myself one recent afternoon in a movie theater. Remember those spaces of cultural encounters? Before me, on the silver screen, was another creator fraught by guilt for having wronged his creation. I referenced the 2023 film Poor Things, directed by Yorgos Lanthimos. The script is screenwriter Tony McNamara's adaptation of the 1992 Frankenstein-inspired novel by Scots writer Alistair Gray. The doctor in Poor Things, played by Willem Dafoe, has been terribly abused, in many ways by his father, essentially raised as a medical psychological experiment. His creation, Bella, played by Emma Stone, calls him God or Father God. The unborn fetus's brain is rescued by the doctor from her dead mother's womb and transplanted into her own mother's brain. The effects are ludicrous, absurd, and at times tragically funny. There is nothing funny about Hardy's novel. However, the connection I make between Bella and Tess, Father God and Thomas Hardy, is that the creation of these women springs from a strange but real care to right the wrongs of their respective societal constructions as 19th century women terribly wronged and so driven to loneliness and death. Both women depart from their creator, admittedly under distinct impetuses, as Bella is the unnatural resurrection of a mother abandoned by society who kills herself, while Tess is disturbingly resurrected as a most penitent self. We encounter both Bella's independent flamboyance and Tess's moral flagellation intriguingly as offerings of atonement to their creators. Bella and Tess are uncanny in their forbearance, at once ghostly and vibrantly whole. A fierce Bella forgives Father God for his rather arrogantly careless creation of her when she returns to his deathbed to ease him into the next world, and then to learn a surgery practice that is perhaps more compassionate, if no less bizarre, than Father God's. A lamenting ghost of Tess glides into her creator's consciousness a decade after her narrative death, bizarrely affording her creator forgiveness for his own complicity in wronging the woman Hardy has loved in Tess. In asking their creators to let them go, one in an earthly sense and the other in a spiritual sense, each woman is asking to be forgotten and becomes unforgettable. We cannot forget Bella or Tess, not only because we cannot forget how they've been wronged, but also because we cannot forget their meaning as spirited inspirations, their creators' responses to something amiss in a culture that perceives and demeans women as other. It is the spirit in and of Tess that has made Hardy's novel to me a cultural encounter that I reread almost annually out of a somewhat awe in Hardy's vulnerability, just as he could not resist recalling Tess's voice beyond her grave. I cannot resist what critic Sarah Meyer perceives as the essence of Hardy's Tess, a woman who embodies strong powers of will, reason, and moral integrity. I would add to these traits in Tess her feelings, raw and generous emotions that she boldly expresses in a venerable and vulnerable prostration of grace before her beloved Angel Clare, and by extension, before her creator, Thomas Hardy, and Hardy's readers. Will, reason, moral integrity, and emotion offer us some significant human attributes or ways of understanding the degree to which any individual fits within their society. As I've pondered both the particulars and the parameters of the Pope's attention to the cultural encounter, I note its significance to Hardy in 1891 when he wrote Tess. Tess is an integral participant in her Victorian rural society in southwest England, but in many ways, she is outside its cultural norms. She is othered in large part by her own high demands of self, to will, to reason, and to be good, higher than most of those she encounters, even while these others fault Tess for her lack of will, reason, and moral integrity. Tess's feelings, which she expresses honestly, are in her equally her sense and sensibility. Hardy shows them to be part of a nature that compels the creator and reader because it is so naturally and unabashedly alive and caring in a rural culture that more often than not cannot perceive itself, notably the effects of itself on its own inmates. Tess, therefore, as outside her culture, provides her reader acute attention to encountering that culture in ways she couldn't if she were inside it. And for this reader, at least, thereby hangs the tale of why Hardy's novel makes a profound difference to those of us who read to wonder how our own human natures relate to and find meaning within our spheres of living. I offer here a brief outline of this paper's questions, asking how and why I read Tess's narrative as one that continues to make a profound difference in my consciousness and conscience. Then, following a brief synopsis of Tess's narrative, the ensuing paper offers reflections on each of these quests. The first, Given that Hardy wrote of his own societal landscape and mores, how did he perceive his relationship to the culture within these spaces, experiences, and perspectives? How did Hardy's experience in writing the novel, the public critical charges he faced in the serial, and his liberation of voice in finally preparing the novel he wished to write, underscore the fraught nature of the writer's relationship with his culture? Second, why is it significant that Tess is inside her society and outside her culture, right from the moment we first meet her at the community's annual May dance? Third, looking at several passages of the novel, how does Hardy create Tess's will, reason, moral integrity, and emotion to show her as a woman wronged tragically, but ultimately not displaced or silenced? This reading includes an intersectional focus, heeding the multiple oppressions Tess bears. Fourth, how does her resurrected voice in the 1901 poem, Tess's Lament, read as atonement for Hardy and perhaps his reader, especially in 2024 when atonement calls for reparation, for ongoing recognition of wrongdoing, but also a grace that seeks not what it cannot fix, but that which it might repair by not forgetting? Or said another way, how might listening to the pain in Tess's own humility urge Hardy and his readers to pay forward insights and privileges that possibly could deflect future oppression and suffering? And this brings me to a brief concluding question, the fifth. What trivialities in our own self-importance do we need to forget in order to remember the largesse in the amazing goodness of forgiveness, in the voice known as dignity? And because I love a compelling detective quest, how does the title page epigraph on Hardy's 1912 version of Tess, drawn from Shakespeare's Two Gentlemen of Verona, evidence the writer's wounded self, comforted by a forgiving Tess? In selecting a classic work for this talk, I appreciate that while many have read Hardy's narrative of Tess, it might not have been recently, while others haven't yet encountered it for any number of reasons, including Hardy's reputation as a tragic, even melodramatic storyteller. So here's a quick synopsis of its most significant narrative moments and twists. A disclaimer: in order to make my argument, I need to reveal the ending, but hopefully this will not deter too much the effect of the journey for those who've not yet embarked. The novel begins by introducing us to the Der Bayfield family. As this laboring class family's socioeconomic circumstances have worsened over time, their present name reflects the distance from its original prestige. Though Tess, of a radiant but natural beauty, has been supported by her family to attend the local grammar school and has shown a quite capable intelligence, Tess's father, Jack, suffers a too comfortable proximity to drink, which challenges his own physical health and his dependability as a breadwinner on the family's small farm. So all hands are needed to ensure a livelihood. Her mother, Joan, represents the complex combination of zealous ambition and weak will, a foolishness that might well be beyond her fault, which, however, proves dangerous for Tess. While Joan relies heavily on Tess for labor inside and outside the cottage, the mother's own hard work and a relentless call to joy, exhibited in the love of song she instills in Tess as her foot rocks the cradle of the youngest while her arms are busy at the washboard. One of her parents' demands for labor sadly leads Tess and her younger brother, Abraham, to experience an accident that costs the family their lone horse and means of marketing their produce. Tess's guilt and her mother's ambition land Tess as worker, purposefully and ironically, in the D'Urberville mansion of Alec and his mother. Alec's now deceased father earlier purchased the old D'Urberville name, that which Tess's family has long lost access to. This inauthentic ownership of an upper-class name provokes a careless arrogance in the son. Unable to control his ravenous appetite for Tess, one night Alec rapes her. Tess immediately leaves his employ, but 9 months later she gives birth to a sickly child she christens Sorrow, who soon dies. Sorrow is denied not only a church baptism, but also Christian burial, though Tess valiantly fights both her hypocritical father and the vicar for her child's right to dignity and her own solace for a mother's grief. The narrative becomes a tale of Tess's journeying throughout Hardy's Wessex as she variously works where she can find labor. Following her child's death, she at first finds hope in the rather bucolic dairy of Farmer Crick, where she meets and falls in love with Angel Clare, a middle-class preacher's son who is studying farming in order to go to Brazil as a well-meaning, if misguided, colonialist. As the Hardy fates would have it, Tess tries to confess to Angel her sin of having been raped, but her written missive is inadvertently shoved beneath the carpet. Though she is genuinely in love with Angel, Tess believes the other dairymaids, who are equally head over heels enamored with him, have more right to Angel than she, a tarnished woman. However, Angel's eyes are only for Tess, and so a tremulous bride and a buoyant groom wed, but their wedding night is ominous. A host of signs relentlessly stalking the couple with D'Urberville family curses. As the candles burn low, Angel surprisingly confesses to Tess that a few years earlier he had been tempted into a one-night affair with an older woman. Tess, greatly relieved upon hearing this, forgives Angel on the spot, trusting that the confession of her own unwanted encounter will similarly be forgiven. However, Angel cannot reconcile the pure Tess he thought he married with the woman he sees before him and blames as damaged goods. Though he had decided against Brazil in favor of transporting the wisdom gleaned from southern English dairy farming to northern England, the despondent Angel rashly goes off to foreign lands. He denies a suffering Tess the mite she asks of him, forgiveness. Exposing his own sorrow is flawed with selfish hypocrisy in the sanctimonious words he flings at this woman, several times wounded. Oh, Tess, forgiveness does not apply to the case. You were one person. Now you are another. My God, how can forgiveness meet such a grotesque prestidigitation as that? Angel leaves Tess with a little money, which she promptly gives to her mother and father to care for her siblings. Tess seeks labor where she can find it, often needing to dodge the cruelty of unwanted attention, even bullying by men. She tries unsuccessfully to meet with Angel's parents to seek mercy there. When her nemesis, Alec D'Urberville, returns as a supposed born-again Christian and then resorts to his true nature, Tess avoids him as long as possible. However, upon her father's death, her family becomes destitute, and so she gives up waiting for Angel's return and marries Alec because he promises fiscal care for her family. The eventual returned appearance of a very worn Angel on her threshold provokes a somewhat crazed Tess to beseech him to stay away from her. Too late, too late. But I say, it is too late. She reascends the stairs to a jeering Alec, for he is always jeering. The distraught Tess stabs him, killing her rapist, and then in madness runs after Angel. The two experience the nuptial night denied them years earlier, before waking in the middle of the night, and a half-hearted belief by the lovers that they might walk to freedom. At last, Tess begs the chance to rest, while Angel watches over her. And as the sorrowful dawn rises, Tess raises herself from a cold Stonehenge slab to sacrifice herself to the police with a humility born of a magnanimous and quiet dignity. I am ready. She is hanged for her crime. The novel ends in the midst of Angel and Tess's sister Liza Lou trudging up the road Tess descended to her capture. The two cling, Hardy intimates, to a suffering only these two can know as witnesses of Tess's hanging imposed by a merciless society. Tess is a cultural encounter of sobering but redemptive difference. As I promised earlier, some reflections on Hardy's own relationship to his culture gain us some understanding of Tess as a creation out of that relationship. I begin these reflections with a story of my own. In July 2008, I found myself experiencing amazing fluency between several time currents. At that year's biennial Thomas Hardy International Conference and Festival in Dorset, England, one of the organizers slyly introduced a sprightly woman, the 102-year-old Norrie Woodall, as the daughter of Tess. Yes, that Tess, Hardy's own dairymaid, Tess D'Urberville. As many on this call know, Hardy, an amazing storyteller and poet of unforgettable impressions of human nature, found his characters within current and historical events of his famed Wessex, which is where he located Norrie's mum, Augusta Way. One of Hardy's biographers, Claire Tomalin, relays Hardy's own words as self-assured local historian. At the dates presented in the various narrations, things were like that in Wessex, says Hardy. The inhabitants lived in certain ways, engaged in certain occupations, kept alive certain customs, just as they are shown doing in these pages. These pages connote both the manuscripts of Hardy's narratives and the current and archive newspapers he read that inspired many of his stories. A 2008 edition of the London newspaper, the Daily Mail, relays the story of Norrie, the last living person who knew Hardy, intriguingly related to Tess, and whom I met toward the end of her life ever so briefly. The Mail's journalist, Sarah Chalmers, wrote, "More than a century has passed since that day in 1888 when a 48-year-old Hardy first set eyes upon the bewitching Augusta Way. As youngsters, Augusta and her 3 sisters would regularly milk the cows in the fields outside their father's dairy. By the time she reached 18, Augusta had grown into a striking woman who turned many a head in the local village, including Hardy's. Hardy, then married to his first wife, Emma, regularly walked past the Way dairy to reach Kingston Morrid, a mansion house whose proprietor encouraged his literary endeavors. This very likely was because a very young child, Thomas, frequented this home with his mother, who was employed as housekeeper there. Jessica Hardy was an important and relentless influencer in her beloved son's education and pursuit as writer. Her own Dorset village of origin, Emister, is where Hardy situates the home of Angel Clare, his parents, and their parish. I visited that parsonage and over tea in its lovely quiet garden, been struck by the proximity of the church's large steeple bearing down its gaze, serene but stern, on nature's bountiful foliage. Here is evidence that Hardy knew well when creating Angel's love of the naturally beautiful, even as he is unable to avoid the church's sobering surveillance and arguably too strident judgment of Tess. Chalmers quotes Augustus's daughter, Norrie. "My mother and her sisters would sit outside and milk the cows as Thomas Hardy walked past, although they never spoke to each other. Hardy was a very shy man and wouldn't make advances like that. Yet my mother was very beautiful and must have caught his eye. He said himself some years later that the memory must have entered his mind when he was creating the character of Tess. Indeed, he began writing Tess in 1888, the very year he first espied Augusta. In 1891, the weekly illustrated newspaper, The Graphic, published Tess of the D'Urbervilles, originally subtitled A Pure Woman Faithfully Presented, as a serial. Even though it was censored, Chalmers notes its content, the tale of a milkmaid who was raped, was criticized by prurient Victorians as an overly sympathetic portrayal of a fallen woman. Today, I teach the novel in my seminar on intersectionality, agreeing with literary scholar Sarah E. Meyer that, quote, Tess is the focus of Hardy's complex exploration of a number of significant themes, including the fate of innocence in a chaotic world without justice. Chalmers' article continues. A few years after Hardy first saw her, Augusta Way married local baker, Arthur Bugler. The pair opened up their own hotel and tea shop in Dorchester, where her path would again cross with Hardy. By the time Augustus's children were teenagers, Hardy had formed a theatrical group, the Hardy Players. In 1924, he staged the first production of Tess of the D'Urbervilles, and rehearsals took place in the Bugler family hotel. Although by then in his 80s, and married for a second time, Hardy retained a keen eye for beauty and insisted that Gertrude, Augustus's eldest daughter and Norrie's sister, take the lead role. Norrie's newsflash is preceded by another. Decades before he encountered the gorgeous young maid Augustus, a 16-year-old Hardy read an announcement in his local paper of a public hanging. Hardy witnessed this horrific event, recalling to many listeners his unforgettable impressions of the hanged, beautiful woman in white, whom beside Augusta Way he would resurrect as Tess. 19th century news accounts, amazingly updated in the 21st, report how Elizabeth Martha Brown murdered her violent husband but walked to the scaffold with, quote, extraordinary demeanor, as attendants on either side were entirely overcome, for she bore her awful position with the greatest resignation and composure. Hardy, forever traumatized by this experience on many levels, turned not only his middle-aged physical allure for beauty, but also what would become a lifelong guilt for complicity as witness into writing Tess, raped by the man she later murders, as a pure woman, terribly wronged. His biographer, Michael Milgate, notes the teenager's sexual allure for the hanged body, perhaps further adding to Hardy's shame. Quote, I remember what a fine figure she showed against the sky as she hung in the misty rain, and how the tight black silk gown set off her shape as she wheeled half round and back. And in a later journal entry, Hardy revealed the encounter as almost otherworldly or spiritual, writing, I saw. They had put a cloth over the face. How, as the cloth got wet, her features came through it. That was extraordinary. Hardy's reader perceives the writer's grief and rage at his culture's wronging of Tess. She is initially violated by the male privilege of Alec d'Urberville in the Chase Forest, and then abandoned on her wedding night by the moral hypocrisy of Angel Clare. Tess's survival depends on her own will and work. For her birth, family's ignorance, poverty, and careless scapegoating of Tess expose her to the sexual appetite of Alec. Alec's rape of Tess precipitates self-centered and hypocritical Angel to exile her from a marriage before it begins, and I think it highly probable that the thoughtful, if flawed Hardy was aware of his own hypocrisy, or at least contradiction, in his articulated fear of the new woman. Her appeal to vote, to voice her views, beside what critics, including Nina Auerbach, and biographers, including Evelyn Hardy, perceive as Hardy's response to the fallen woman. In 1890, 1 year before he published Tess for the first time, he partnered with Walter Besant and Eliza Lynn Linton in a symposium paper on the woman question and sexuality in fiction. Situated beside his spiritual versus traditional Christian recognition of God or religion, Hardy also struggled with an unabashed esteem for Darwinian and Spencerian regard for evolution. Hardy's words for God were immanent will or force, and an allegiance to his parish that found him not only in a pew of St. Michael's Church, Stinsford, every Sunday, but also serving as a fully engaged lay reader of the parish, where his notes remain in the church's registry. Hardy visibly struggled, lived, we might say, within an actively tempestuous but always forthright, maybe even tender, relationship with his own creator. In Tess, Hardy arguably offers a diatribe against a world that is callously devaluing women, and has lost a moral guilt and shame, which the novel returns to both author and reader. This moral shame leads me to the final comment I make today on Hardy's relationship to his culture. He wrote no less than 7 editions of this novel, which was highly censored and kept first from publication as a serial in the Graphic. The plethora of versions was due to Hardy seeking freedom to get the narrative right, to ensure there was no question that Alec d'Urberville has in fact raped Tess, that in equal truth, Tess was presented as a woman of strong will and forbearance, but equal humility, of explicit forgiveness, but also explicit trust in her own rights to forgiveness. The novel, along with his final narrative, Jude the Obscure, were both written in the bedroom he shared with his first wife, Emma, and were largely responsible for the dissolution of their marriage. She voiced her sense of betrayal to Hardy that he would write women of such scandal. He literally left her bed, designing a 3rd floor to Maxgate, their home in Dorchester, where he would resume the remainder of all his writings, his poetry. Several years after her death, and newly married to his second wife, he would fall in love all over again with Emma, reaching out to her spirit in a series of love poems. Hardy wouldn't give in to the Bowdlerizing demanded by publishers and public, and his 1912 title page reveals his true intent all along in creating Tess. Here it is. Tess of the d'Urbervilles, a pure woman, faithfully presented by Thomas Hardy. The page's Shakespearean epigraph, which I will read as my paper's conclusion. Poor wounded name, my bosom as a bed, shall lodge thee. Moving from Hardy's relationship with his culture to my paper's second quest, Tess's charged association with her own, I draw attention to the significance of the setting for Hardy's introduction of her to the reader. A few lines of this first chapter underscore Tess's separateness from her culture. The 19th century rural annual May dance, a pagan celebration of spring and fertility, in which the weaving of ribbons around a pole display the ritual's regard for beauty. Tess has given time, the others haven't, to such adornment, uniquely aligning her with this cultural center. She was a fine and handsome girl. She wore a red ribbon in her hair and was the only one of the company who could boast of such pronounced adornment. Angel Clare, a stranger ambling through the Vale of Blackmore, boisterously celebrating its May Day dance, takes special note of Tess, and she of him. However, Angel accepts the advances of another more forward maiden, quickly forgetting Tess, who is somewhat perplexed by his slight. Tess's red adornment is notably prompted by awareness of her natural beauty, which arrests but does not immediately move Angel. Later in the narrative, the two meet again at a dairy farm and become engrossed in a conversation, musing, "The hobble of being alive is rather serious." Angel is unable not to be intellectually and emotionally mesmerized by just that touch of rarity about her, shaping such sad imaginings, surprised to find her feelings, the ache of modernism and advanced ideas, strange, impressive, interesting, pathetic. Angel's eventual, almost ethereal swoon over Tess began when he was momentarily struck by the singular ribbon in her hair. But just as he does later in the novel, in a much more tragically defining moment, he abandons Tess for an easier choice. As Hardy is known for his awareness of his own culture's mores, as well as their documented recordings in such authoritative sources as dictionaries, I think it's significant that the Oxford English Dictionary notes that 1890, 1 year prior to the novel's first publication date, historicizes the first time culture was identified as a center, an organized space in which communities gathered to celebrate rituals, including ancient ones long preceding 1890. My point here is to underscore the importance Hardy gives to Tess upon the reader's earliest encounter with her as a cultural actor within a cultural space. And within this space, she is seen as an oddity, an other, so marked by a cultural emblem of a cultural activity, the ribbon, identified with the May dance. I move along now to my paper's third alignment of Tess and culture, marking a few passages in the novel that emphasize her strong will, reason, moral integrity, and human emotion. In her introduction to Tess, Sarah Meyer notes that Hardy's resilient Tess is aware of her era's social injustices, reflecting Hardy's wrath at Victorian male vanity. Tess's spirit and individuality refuse to succumb to Alec's manipulations and declarations that she should act as every woman. Meyer finds this especially poignant when Alec d'Urberville, shamelessly proud he fathered Tess's child born of his rape, seeks to renew his chance to own Tess by offering to economically help her family. However, Tess, in the words of Meyer, refuses to be appropriated by Alec and so renounces him. Not once, but over and over. Hardy is equally adamant to grieve for Tess and to salute her rebellious outrage as enacting his own dialectical response to Tess's fire. Quote, "She had no fear of him now, and in the cause of her confidence, her sorrow lay." Tess refuses to buy Alec's fiscal support by falsely claiming she loves him, admitting, "I didn't understand your meaning till it was too late." Alec carelessly dismisses her resistance. "Oh, that's what every woman says." Meyer perceives Hardy's admiration for Tess in firing back. "How can you dare to use such words?" Her eyes flashing as the latent spirit, of which he was to see more someday, awoke in her. "My God, I could knock you out of the gig. Did it never strike your mind that what every woman says, some women may feel?" Hardy's novel here launches the moral strength of Tess's conscious will of her later poetic lament. A few of the novel's passages illustrate how Tess's Natural beauty, notably in her hair, spin a web tragically entrapping before releasing this female within a male myopic society, creating what Hardy scholar Keith Wilson deems an uncanny and lasting bond between writer and character. Hardy moves Tess's tragedies along at rapid pace. In the middle of the night following the May dance, an exhausted Tess, substituting for her drunken father, falls asleep while driving the family wagon to market, unable to avoid crashing into a mail cart, which kills the family's only horse and thus livelihood by trade. Her exploitative mother snatches the opportunity to make the most of Tess's beauty, identified by her luxurious hair, arranging for Tess to go work at a manor now owned by the self-centered rake Alec d'Auberville. On a Saturday evening, after a tired Tess has enjoyed the day's fare independently from the other d'Auberville employees, she decides to wait to walk the 3 miles home with them for what she believes will be communal safety. Alec's persistent and rather bullying stalking has led Tess to a disturbing mistrust of his presence, even on this starkly moonlit night when suddenly a loud laugh from behind Tess's back is accompanied by the red coal of a cigar, revealing Alec d'Auberville standing there alone. Tess, more adamantly than ever, refuses his offer of a ride home on his horse. Her reason dictates her knowledge of his earlier advances as threatening, which so far she has been able to dislodge from any lasting ill effects. Hardy's portrait, criticizing the realism of rural hierarchies, catapults Tess into a fateful fight with her nemesis, Carr, another worker on Alex's estate, who has been the sometime lover of Alex, who's now pursuing Tess. The scene unfolds as Tess is locked out of the companionship and protection of her fellow workers. Quote, "The basket being large and heavy, Carr had placed it on top of her head. From the back of her head, a kind of rope could be seen descending to some distance below her waist. This was not her hair. It was a black stream of something oozing from her basket, and it glistened like a slimy snake in the cold, still rays of the moon. Treacle, it was." By this time, there had arisen a shout of laughter at the extraordinary appearance of Carr's back, which irritated the Dark Queen into getting rid of the disfigurement by the first sudden means available, provoking the others' convulsions at the spectacle of her gyrating horizontally on the herbage. Tess, who had hitherto held her peace at this wild moment, could not help joining in with the rest. To her horror, the Dark Queen closed her fists and squared up to Tess. The other inebriated women also chimed in with an animus against Tess, who, indignant and ashamed, was about to rush off alone when a horseman emerged almost silently from the corner of the hedge that screened the road, and Alec d'Auberville looked around about them. To Tess, he whispered, "Jump up behind me. We'll get shot of the screaming cats in a jiffy." Away from the cats and into the wolf's lair, Tess is led through the tumultuous night into the fog-ravaged chase, beneath whose trees the rider begs the maid rest so that he might prey upon her locks strewn among nature's strands of fern, as she lies deeply drenched in a sleep of exhausted despair. As we know, she names the child born of this assault Sorrow, whom she feeds on the fields where she works, a mysterious recluse from the working company. Hardy writes, her bonnet, pulled so far over her brow that none of her face is disclosed while she binds sheaves of wheat, though her complexion may be guessed from a stray twine or two of dark brown hair which extends below the curtain of her bonnet. Perhaps one reason why she seduces casual attention is that she never courts it, though the other women often gaze round about them. Cultural critic Galia Offek historicizes the Victorian bonnet as emblematic of the devotional woman, further reinforced by Tess as Madonna, whose humanity and youth are tenderly visualized in that recalcitrant tress or two peeking out from the bonnet of virtuous concealment. For too short a time, Tess knows true love born of her own goodness when Angel meets her for a second time at Talbothy's Dairy. He fetishizes Tess's hair, somewhat weirdly braiding the physical and the spiritual. She had stretched one arm so high above her coiled-up hair that he could see its satin delicacy above the sunburn. The brimfulness of her nature breathed from her. It was a moment when a woman's soul is more incarnate than at any other time, when the most spiritual beauty bespeaks itself flesh, and sex takes the outside place in the presentation. The sun slanting in by the window upon his back as he held her tightly to his breast, upon her inclining face, upon the blue veins of her temple, upon her naked arm and her neck, and into the depths of her hair. Offic's tensions are visibly in action in this passage. Tessa's coiled up hair associates her with Eve as both beguiling and beguiled by the serpent. Further, Tessa's tamed hair is not worn loosely as we might expect a maiden to don her tresses, due most likely to the pragmatic demands of her necessary employment as milking maid. Her bound hair suggests that she is maid no more. Her controlled hair showing her bound to men. And while she in many respects is once again at the mercy of a man's gaze upon her, Tessa's ethereal quality in this scene liberates her from restrictive certainty as either young or old, and yields her nature a timeless essence, refusing society's temporal limitations and ideals. Offutt remarks that Hardy's portrayal of hair was informed by contemporary influential scientific and evolutionary models, no less that it drew on old biblical, artistic, and literary traditions. As noted above, Angel's fascination with Tess is his vision of her as divinely untouched and also sagaciously modern. Tragically, on their wedding night, when they each confess to a single earlier sexual encounter with another, the unmodern Angel abandons Tess, unable to accept that the assault on her warrants compassion rather than misplaced moral judgment against her. Years after Alex's rape and Angel's abandonment, Tess, a refugee, migrating between hard labor and men's lascivious bullying and stalking, hides one night beneath a tree where she reflects, "If all were only vanity, who would mind it? All was, alas, worse than vanity." She wakes to discover that she has shared the tree with pheasants driven down into this corner by some shooting party, where they had fallen one by one as she had heard them. With the impulse of a soul who could feel for kindred sufferers as much as for herself, Tessa's first thought was to put the still living birds out of their torture. She was ashamed of herself for her gloom of the night, based on nothing more tangible than a sense of condemnation under an arbitrary law of society, which had no foundation in nature. And so Tess went onward with fortitude, her recollection of the birds' silent endurance of their night of agony, impressing upon her the relativity of her own, if she could once rise high enough to despise opinion. But that she could not do so long as it was held by Claire. She breakfasted at an inn where several young men were troublesomely complimentary to her good looks. Somehow she felt hopeful, for was it not possible that her husband might claim her even yet? But she was bound to take care of herself on the chance of it and keep off lovers. To this end, Tess resolved to run no further risks from her appearance, and with her little scissors, by the aid of a pocket looking glass, she mercilessly nipped her eyebrows off, and thus insured against aggressive admiration, she went on her even way. Tears came into her eyes for very pity of herself. "I'll always be ugly now, because Angel is not here, and I have nobody to take care of me." Offutt informs that Christianity, in addition to Jewish and Islamic law, associated women's hair with sexual evil. Indeed, head hair was not only concealed but shaved or plucked, and eyebrows were removed too. Tessa's purposeful uglifying of self by cutting off her shapely brows underscores her Christian goodness, such evidence a cruel demand from a social culture Hardy perceives as complicit in Alex's rape of her. When Angel belatedly appears, again, he finds his abandoned beloved married to Alec, finally caving to the criminal's badgering for marriage to him in exchange for saving her widowed mother and siblings from starvation and homelessness. The shock of Angel's return, after believing he never would, releases a tormented madness in Tess. She murders Alec in intuitive frenzy because his accumulated violations of her sanctity have cost her the soul of her nature. Why is that not enough for Hardy? Why resurrect Tess 10 years later to speak to us from the other side? 10 years marks a period of significant time for a character's creator to spend with their creation. Tessa's Lament, a poem espousing grief, carries a keening sorrow beyond her grave that Angel Clare was ever conscious of her. The mental setting of the lament is the chase, the darkly secretive forest where Alec, the man whom Tess detests, rapes her. In her poem, Tess assumes blame, not for the rape, but for hurting Angel in being raped. She finds herself culpable for the harm she brings him. Following his own divulgence of an earlier escapade in which he gave into a one-night temptation with a woman, Angel provides mentally and morally unable to perceive that his own seduction is much less physically and socially traumatic than Tess's. Identifying him for Hardy is not only more culpable than his bride, but also morally weaker than the truly violated, long-suffering Tess, selfless in mourning how she has hurt Angel. I believe Hardy, for many reasons given in this paper's beginning, sees his own culpability for Tess's wrong within Angel's. Why else would he write toward the end of his novel, in two passages, extremely close to each other, just paragraphs apart, a letter that Tess writes in desperation at the end to Angel. Angel, I live entirely for you. I love you too much to blame you for going away. And also writes, this is Hardy writing now, to express Angel's innermost thoughts. Having long discredited the old systems of mysticism, Angel now began to discredit the old appraisements of morality. He thought they wanted readjusting. Who was the moral man? Still more pertinently, who was the moral woman? The beauty or ugliness of a character lay not only in its achievements, but in its aims and impulses. Its true history lay not among things done, but among things willed. In her Lament's ghostly persona, I read Tess's grief for what she understands as her sins, as the catharsis of her creator. And now he's gone. And now he's gone. And now he's gone. And it was I who did it all. 'Twas I who made the blow to fall on him who thought no guile. I cannot bear my fate as writ. I'd have my life unbe, would turn my memory to a blot, make every relic of me rot, my doings be as they were not, and gone all trace of me. To further appreciate these seemingly self-effacing lines from the lament, I highlight Keith Wilson's brilliant study of Hardy's refusal to let go of Tess out of reverence for her moral consciousness. We might recall Tess's care for the distressed pheasants in Wilson's insight that Hardy's definition of altruism in a diary entry reflects a moral integrity. The pain we see in others reacting on ourselves leads us to understand us and them as one. Wilson continues, the capacity for human consciousness to share in the sufferings of others and in so doing to escape the self-reverence of an Alec or an Angel is surely fundamental to the characterization of Tess. Wilson's essay notes Hardy's awareness of his own failures as a male of his era. And yet, Wilson puts aside these personal realities as less responsible for the 1901 return of Tess's haunted voice than Hardy's insistence on the paradoxes and contradictions of human circumstance, most particularly as manifested in the apparently chance evolution of human consciousness of that circumstance. Inspired by the importance Wilson perceives in Tess's moral and cognitive autonomy, I find her lament inevitable, if not necessary, to Hardy's purpose in creating her. For the poem is Tess's spoken consciousness of the reality of circumstance that she experiences. For a blighted world to benefit from Tess's altruism, Hardy ensures that we listen to her long after she is hanged for killing Alec. Hardy would have us listen to her ghost with an empathy that braves feeling anguished by her anguish. In accepting responsibility for causing her beloved Angel pain for her rape beneath the trees, Tess provides cathartic atonement for Victorian societal wrongs to women. My final codicil. What about that 1912 title page with its Shakespearean epigraph? Poor wounded name, my bosom as a bed shall lodge thee. We might at first believe these lines written by Hardy to Tess, but in Two Gentlemen of Verona, these are voiced by Julia, who has been abandoned by her lover Proteus. They're written to Proteus. They are lines of forgiveness voiced by woman wronged to the one she loves too much to blame. And in Forgiving Angel, I believe Tess's lamentation of the pain she gives to the one she loves is Hardy writing his creature's forgiveness of him, and so the creature's gift to her creator, his uncanny atonement. Thank you.
So, pardon me. Thank you very much, Rebecca. A fascinating talk indeed. We have one question where we're close to the end of the time, but we have one question which I can read to you from Carol Rubicki, if I pronounce it correctly. And Carol says, do you think it possible to see in Tess a Christ-like figure, one who bears the sins committed against her, but also recognizes a sense of guilt, the result of having to speak out and challenge a culture which will not allow her a voice, knowing that to speak out violates her own nature? Kind of a complex question, and I leave it to you.
Wow, a very, very thoughtful question. And I think I thank you for that very much. I think yes. A simple answer to the large question, yes, and on many levels that yes. Tess is revolutionary as you know, Jesus, the human man on earth, is revolutionary. Revolutionary in large part because forgiving enough to speak out that which others did not speak. And I think also that Hardy makes Tess very, very human. There are moments where the reader, I think, wants to scream into the novel, don't, or say something, or, you know, this is not the time to look away. And she, you know, she is very human in her need for Angel. She is very human in that moment where she laughs at her nemesis and brings, you know, the other workers upon her, which then precipitates, of course, a desperate need to get on the horse with a very dangerous man. So I think there is something wonderfully vulnerable in everybody associated with this paper, in Hardy, in Tess, and I would hope in the reader, I know at least in this reader, that I'm always asking new questions every time I read Tess.
Rebecca, in as well, you know, the ruined woman in literature usually winds up dead. Maggie, a girl of the streets; Edna in The Awakening. Edna swims into the sea. Maggie jumps in, I guess, if I remember correctly, into the East River. But Hardy changes that a little bit because she winds up dead in the end as well. But she at least has an opportunity to avenge herself on the society that destroyed her. And I wonder what do you make of that? Why do you think Hardy sort of spun the story, the conventional story, in a little bit different way?
Yeah, maybe in that title page, you know, that giving her that I'm going to let you know that this fallen woman is a pure woman, very directly before you even encounter her, you know, giving that sort of that editorializing of her. But also, I think in the resurrection of this woman who is distraught in the poem. But he changes the sense of her distraughtness. In other words, it's not according to the Victorian prudery that she is distraught because she's fallen. She was raped. And in that experience, she has inadvertently caused the man she really does love, Angel. She has caused him harm. She has caused him hurt. She has caused him grief. She has disrupted his life. And again, I think it's this sense of altruism in Hardy, you know, that is in that poem. He really shifts, Hardy in the poem, shifts the attention away from the fallenness of, you know, as in sinning, to her realizing that, you know, she has hurt somebody. Yeah. And just like she sees the pheasants as hurt, and that somehow is more important to her than her own hurt. But somehow recognizing that hurt to make her more human again, recognizing that hurt, she realizes that allows her to connect. that allows her to have an empathy or an understanding with another being, another natural being.
Don't you get the sense when you read the novel that you would like to smack Angel across
Oh,
give him one good
yes.
shot and say, snap out of it, see things as they
Absolutely.
are.
Absolutely. And students, when they think they've seen the worst in Alec, by the time they get to Angel, they are beside themselves. And I'm so grateful for that, because I do believe, that Hardy identifies more with Angel, strangely, in some complex ways, than he does with Alec. And that is, he did it. Hardy accomplished, that, like you said, that he lets Tess come back and be that voice, that critical voice of her culture.
I guess, Michael, I think we're out of time.
Yeah.
I'll turn it over to Mike Scott then. Again, Rebecca,
Okay.
thanks very much. It was a very enjoyable paper, and we appreciate the time and effort you took to put it together. So thanks
Thank
again.
you all.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I'll just make one comment. A terrific paper. I really enjoyed it. But you took me back. I remember the novel, of course, but I also remember maypole dancing, because I used to be a maypole dancer as a
Wow.
child. And the most difficult dance was the spider's web. And the spider's web takes you through, and it is absolutely beautiful when it's finished.
Yes.
But if you were inside it, you wouldn't be able to get out.
Yes.
And it's beautiful, almost like hair being
Yes.
owned. So,
and you're reminding me too of that beauty which is ensnared, right?
correct.
The moral ensnarement of which is, wow, that's something for me to give further thought to. Thank you for that.
All right.
Spiders and snakes.
Expose my child as a dancer. Yeah, never mind. Rebecca, thanks very much for such a stimulating paper and discussion, and Mike also for engaging in the questions, and also for the questions that came in. I hope everybody that you will join us next week on the 29th of January when Dr. Bob Miola from Loyola University, he'll be talking about Shakespeare and Shakespeare's play Macbeth, which I'm working on at the moment. So I'm really looking forward to that one next week. We have an interesting talk in our free speech at the Crossroads coming up on Wednesday, January the 24th, where we'll be discussing issues relating to refugees. Hugely important issue at the moment. We're coming back to this and looking at it from another angle. We've got somebody from United Nations talking about, from UNITAR, the United Nations teaching organization, talking about the problem of education for people within the refugee issue. So I look forward to that, and I hope you'll join us. 24th of January, 11 a.m. Eastern Time, 4 p.m. GMT. I'd like to thank people at Georgetown University for supporting the series. Jack DeGioia, the president, and the vice president, Tom Banshoff. Thanks also to Julia Murillo and Mary Gordon. My thanks today to Mike Collins for asking the questions. At Blackfriars Hall, John O'Connor, the regent, Richard Finn, the director of Las Casas Institute. So we look forward to seeing you perhaps this coming Wednesday. But I'm Mike Scott. I'm at Blackfriars Hall, Oxford. You can follow me now on Facebook rather than on Twitter. Thank you for joining us, and goodbye.